Okay, let's dive in. Does the European Union plan to seize your savings? Now, that sounds, pretty sensational, maybe something you just scroll past. But interestingly, a recent post from the European Central Bank itself, the ECB, actually sparked this exact worry. They openly said there is an urgent need to channel retail savings into capital markets to finance EU priorities.
Mm.
So while the technical answer is, well, no, they're not planning some kind of direct grab like with any big policy shift, the real story and what it might mean for you is buried in the details. Today, we're digging into the EU's proposed Savings and Investment Union, the SIU. We want to unpack what it is, who's pushing it, why now, and yeah, what it could mean for your money.
And it's worth remembering, this isn't exactly brand new. I mean, the idea of using our savings, retail savings, for wider EU goals, that conversation started way back, maybe around 2015, with something called the Capital Markets Union, or CMU.
Right, the CMU, that sounds like the perfect place to start then. Can you unpack that for us? What was the CMU aiming for?
Absolutely. So the CMU's main goal was basically to knit together the capital markets of all the EU countries, make them work more like one single market. The idea was to make it much easier for money-think loans, investments, to just flow across borders within the EU, like building a financial superhighway, you could say.
Okay, sounds straightforward enough.
Well, yes, but it hit quite a bit of resistance. A lot of EU countries, particularly the smaller ones, felt it would mostly help the big players, France, Germany. They worried it might lead to big banks snapping up smaller local banks or companies moving to the bigger financial centers. There's an analogy that sort of fits like the euro itself. You have Germany, a huge economy, sharing a currency with, say, Slovakia, a smaller one. The euro can end up making Germany more competitive because the currency is maybe weaker than a purely German currency would be, while it makes Slovakia less competitive because the euro is stronger than maybe a Slovak currency would be. The CMU felt like it could do something similar with capital flows.
Yeah, I see the parallel. And it's often the case, isn't it? When a policy cooked up by technocrats doesn't quite get the democratic nod, it gets a makeover, a rebrand. Which leads us, I guess, straight to the SIU, the Savings and Investment Union, that officially landed back in March.
Exactly. And the SIU brings back a lot of those CMU ideas, no doubt about it. But this time, they seem a bit, let's say, watered down.
Hmm.
And crucially, there's this very explicit focus now on regular folk, on us, the retail investors.
We definitely saw that rhetoric ramp up. I remember hearing Ursula von der Leyen and Christine Lagarde at Davos talking quite openly about tapping into retail savings. Von der Leyen was almost lamenting all this money just, quote, sitting in European bank accounts.
Yeah. And about that figure, she used the 1.4 trillion. It's important to get that right. Our research suggests that wasn't the total savings. That was more like the annual increase in savings. The actual total savings held by Europeans is, well, massive, over 10 trillion. And get this, about 300 billion of new savings each year are actually flowing out into foreign assets. So the EU's big goal with the SIU is finding a way to persuade Europeans to invest that money, especially bit going overseas, into European companies working on the EU's big projects. They're ideological agendas, really. This isn't just moving money around. It's potentially shifting how investment works, where political goals, not necessarily market returns, drive where the capital goes. They could really distort things.
And the person picked to spearhead this is Marie-Louise Albuquerque, right?
Hmm.
Which is interesting given her history with the original CMU proposal that faced pushback.
That's right. And Albuquerque, at the SIU launch event, was pretty clear about where they want this money directed. Green energy, digitization, and defense. She specifically mentioned the Rearm Europe idea. Although, funnily enough, after she said it, there was this pushback saying claims about using savings for defense were fake news, maybe a bit of damage control because technically they aren't seizing it directly.
Right.
But the scale here is, frankly, enormous. A report by Mario Draghi, the former ECB president, estimated the EU needs something like 800 billion every single year in new investment. And the key thing is, governments and big companies, they've pretty much borrowed all they can. They can't cover that gap, which is exactly why the spotlight has swung so sharply onto, well, our savings.
Okay, so if the usual suspects are tapped out, how are they planning to get hold of this retail money? You mentioned carrots and sticks earlier.
Precisely. The main mechanism they're floating is actually quite a big deal. Auto-enrollment. Basically, setting up new, standardized pension schemes across Europe that workers would automatically be put into. And the money going into these pensions, it wouldn't just sit there. It would be channeled to asset managers, think big names like BlackRock, who are aligned with the EU, and they'd be tasked with investing it specifically in green energy, digitization, and defense.
So less choice by default.
Potentially, yes. By default, your pension contributions could automatically flow into these specific areas. Here's a metaphor that might help picture it. Imagine the EU's capital markets are like a big network of rivers and streams. Right now, your savings might be a little stream going into a quiet pond, your bank account, maybe some flows off into foreign rivers. The SIU is like this huge engineering project. They're building dams, digging new canals, all designed to redirect those individual streams or savings into specific big reservoirs, which are these EU-favored companies. The goal is to create one powerful river flowing exactly where they want it to go, towards their policy goals.
That's a vivid picture.
And if you look at the EU's own website about the SIU, they lay out four main pillars, basically. First, incentivize people to invest in stocks rather than just keeping cash or buying government bonds. Second, channel those savings towards businesses working on the EU's big agendas, green tech, digital, etc. Third, push for more integration of European capital markets, kind of like the old CMU idea, maybe through an exchange aggregator, like a single digital window to access all the different European markets, making cross-border trading easier. And fourth, unified supervision, centralizing control over markets, moving power away from individual countries and more towards Brussels.
Okay, and the timeline. They're talking about getting parts of this done by mid-2027, but something's happening sooner.
Yeah, Q2 2027 is the target for partial completion. But the first big step, which they're aiming for this quarter apparently, is about boosting retail participation in markets and improving, quote, financial literacy.
Financial literacy. Sounds reasonable.
Well, yes, but how the EU seems to be defining financial literacy here is interesting. It looks less like neutral education and more like, well, indoctrination, as one source put it. The stated goal is making sure Europeans get the right information to make the right decisions. And the right decision, from their viewpoint, is putting your life savings into specific, often quite risky things. Renewables, digital tech, weapons, even illiquid infrastructure projects, and volatile startups.
Startups. That seems risky for average savers.
It does. And this control over information even extends to things like financial influencers online. There's talk about regulations, mandatory registration, maybe even pre-approving content. It fits a pattern of wanting to shape the narrative, maybe even pushing back against things like Bitcoin, which, by the way, the research we saw suggests the environmental concerns often cited are largely mythical. It points to the EU feeling threatened by crypto, partly because it competes with the euro, which ties back into their push for a central bank digital currency, a CBDC.
So hold on. They want retail investors putting money into risky startups. But at the same time, politicians are saying retail shouldn't speculate. How does that square? It sounds completely contradictory.
It absolutely is contradictory. On one side, the SIU is explicitly designed to get retail money into SMEs, small and medium businesses in these critical sectors. Highly speculative, often.
Huh?
But then you hear politicians saying retail investors need to avoid speculation and just buy and hold these assets long term. It just doesn't match the reality of investing in early-stage companies.
It's a bizarre message.
It gets stranger. Maria Albuquerque, in a presentation described by some as, frankly, unhinged, apparently suggested that the usual protections for retail investors wouldn't really be needed. Why? Because investors would somehow just know they should buy and hold, even though this is money that, as she acknowledged, would otherwise be sitting safely in savings. It ignores basic human behavior.
People tend to panic and sell risky assets when things look shaky, especially with their core savings. And adding another layer of contradiction, Albuquerque also admitted that ultimately, for real GDP growth, they need to focus investment on big companies, not just startups. So why push retail towards the riskiest end? And maybe the most alarming part, she reportedly said that if retail investors do get burned by the SIU, they can't come complaining to Brussels. It sounds like they're trying to wash their hands of responsibility before it even starts. Like, we told you where to put your money, but if it goes wrong, tough luck.
Wow. So given all these issues, the funding gap, the contradictions, the history, what are the actual chances of this SIU succeeding in hitting those massive $800 billion a year targets? Honestly, success looks pretty doubtful based on the current plan. That $800 billion annual need is huge. Even if they somehow convinced Europeans to redirect all of the $300 billion currently going into foreign assets back into Europe, that's still less than half of what's needed. To get the rest, they'd have to persuade people to move money out of their safe savings accounts. And that would require more than just education. It would need, as that source said, intense indoctrination.
Right.
Plus, the whole economic environment right now doesn't exactly scream, take big risks. You've got strict tech regulations hampering potential unicorns, renewable projects struggling or going bust because they're intermittent, and just general uncertainty making people want to save, not speculate.
Yeah.
From our analysis, the only way they could likely force this level of investment redirection is probably through something like a digital euro, especially one with features like negative interest rates, where your savings could effectively be slowly deleted in real time if you just hold on to them.
Okay, let's bring this home. What does all this actually mean for you, the listener, for your own finances and for the markets?
Well, if you're in Europe, it probably means you'll get more opportunities to invest in EU companies, maybe new products, new platforms. It's not necessarily a forced obligation to buy specific things, but if you're employed in Europe, it seems very likely you'll be auto-enrolled into one of these new pension schemes, and by default, your money will automatically flow into companies aligned with EU policy agendas. That's a key takeaway.
Okay, important to be aware of. And the wider market effects.
It could create a situation a bit like the U.S. stock market, where a lot of the upward trend is driven by passive automated investments from 401ks and pension funds, just constant buying pressure. The EU has pension systems too, obviously, but the flows are more scattered now. The SIU aims to consolidate those flows, concentrating them into specific assets within this more unified market.
So opportunities and risks there too.
Definitely. On the opportunity side, if you can figure out which EU-favored assets or SMEs are going to benefit most from these forced pension flows, you might see some decent long-term returns by getting in early. The bad news, though, is that this whole setup looks likely to cause a really unprecedented misallocation of capital. We're talking about channeling vast sums based on political agendas, not necessarily sound economics. It risks seriously distorting markets, propping up potentially failing ideas, and ultimately hindering real organic growth. Doubling down, as our sources suggest, on policies that haven't exactly boosted the EU economy lately.
Doesn't sound ideal.
No. But maybe there's a slight silver lining. If you play it smart, maybe you can navigate these managed markets and do okay, perhaps even thrive. And potentially this huge misallocation could eventually trigger some kind of serious financial or maybe even societal crisis that forces a rethink, pushing the EU back towards freer markets. However, the flip side is that during the next crisis, the EU will almost certainly try to use the digital euro, if it's ready, to gain even more control, not less.
Which leaves us with a pretty big question for you, the listener, to think about. What does this whole trend, the shift in investment philosophy, the centralization of control, really mean for your own financial freedom and autonomy down the road? So, summing up, the SIU is definitely a complex beast with potentially huge implications for your savings and the entire European financial system. Lots to keep an eye on. If you found this deep dive helpful, please do follow, like, and share it. It really helps us out. And you can follow What Bitcoin Taught Me on all the usual places: Twitter X, Nostr, Bluesky, Threads, Instagram, Facebook, LinkedIn. You know the drill. Thanks so much for tuning in.